Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling probably one of the most common brick walls programmers hit, the big data panic moment. You know exactly what I mean. You write this beautiful script, works perfectly on your test data, looks great. Then you feed it a real-world file, maybe to double, triple your RAM size, and bang, the whole system just slows right down, starts grinding.
Yeah, it feels like everything's broken.
Exactly. But it's not a bug in your code, not usually. And it's probably not your CPU being too slow either. It's something deeper. The OS is struggling with memory it doesn't physically have. So for you, the self-taught programmer out there, what's going on? How do you fix this meltdown?
Well, what you're running into is the whole field of external memory algorithms, sometimes called out-of-core computing. It's all about designing ways to handle data when it's just too big for RAM. It has to live on slower storage, like your disk or SSD. The key thing is you can't rely on the default OS behavior. You have to take control yourself.
Okay, so when that script just tanks or slows to an absolute crawl, my first instinct is always need a faster CPU. But you're saying that's not really it. Where's the actual failure point?
It's almost never the CPU in these cases. The bottleneck, the real wall you hit, is input-output, I/O. You're limited by how fast you can get data off that disk. Think about the speed difference. Accessing data in RAM, that's nanoseconds, super fast. But asking the system to fetch something from a random place on your disk, that takes milliseconds.
Nanoseconds versus milliseconds. Okay, sounds tiny, but I guess in computer time.
It's a lifetime. It's literally 5 orders of magnitude slower, 5. Your CPU, which can do billions of things per second, suddenly spends almost all its time just waiting for the disk. That I/O cost completely dominates everything else.
Right. So if you just write your code normally, assuming everything fits in memory, and let the operating system's virtual memory try to bridge that gap, that's when things go bad.
That's exactly when the meltdown happens. If your program starts jumping around, accessing data unpredictably, the OS falls into this state called thrashing.
Thrashing sounds bad.
It is. It's just wasting all its time frantically swapping tiny bits of data pages between RAM and disk. Nothing useful gets done. It's pure overhead.
So the goal of these external memory out-of-core techniques is to stop that, to manage the I/O ourselves.
Precisely. Take explicit control over how and when data moves between disk and memory. Avoid those random accesses.
Okay, taking control. Which brings us to sort of the first commandment of disk I/O, right?
Locality of reference. Absolutely. See, when you ask the disk for data, it doesn't just give you one byte. It reads a whole chunk, a disk block maybe containing $5 items worth of data.
Okay, so you get a chunk whether you wanted one thing or many things in that chunk.
Right. And the cost, the time delay for the disk head to move and spin, you pay that when you ask for the first byte of the block. Getting the rest of the data within that same block is almost free by comparison. So a good external algorithm makes sure that when it pays that huge I/O cost to read a block, it uses all the data in that block, or as much as possible. Maximize the work done per expensive I/O operation. Why fetch 1 byte when you can get, say, 4 kilobytes for the same price?
Okay, so we accept the disk is slow. We need to fetch data in blocks and work on those blocks. What are the basic tools, the fundamental ways a programmer can interact with these huge files without, installing a massive database system?
There are 2 main approaches people start with. The first one, and often the simplest to get going, is data streaming and chunking. This happens at the application level. So in your Python code, for example, you explicitly manage reading the file piece by piece. You load a manageable chunk into memory, process it, then discard it, and load the next one sequentially.
So this is like when you see libraries, like Pandas, offering that chunk size option. Is that what's happening under the hood?
Exactly that. When you use read CSV in Pandas with chunk size 10,000, say, it doesn't load the whole file. It gives you back an iterator object, often called a text file reader.
Right.
And that object handles feeding you those 10,000 row chunks one by one. The big advantages are predictable memory use. It stays low no matter how big the file is, and it's robust. If something crashes, you only need to potentially reprocess the current chunk.
Makes sense. That's foundational for tools like Dask too, right? They manage lots of these little chunks.
Yep, Dask builds a whole task graph over collections of smaller pandas data frames or NumPy arrays, processing them chunk by chunk.
Okay, streaming is great for that sequential pass, like cleaning data or basic transforms. But what if I need to jump around, like read something near the start, then jump way to the end, then back to the middle? Streaming sounds awful for that.
Yeah.
It would be terrible, yeah. For that kind of random access pattern, you look at memory mapped files, or MAP. This is a lower level tool provided by the operating system. It's clever. It maps a file on disk directly into your program's virtual address space.
So the program thinks the whole file is just an array in memory, even if it's terabytes large.
Pretty much, yeah. From the code's perspective, it looks like one giant array. The big win here is potentially zero copy I/O. Data can sometimes move directly from the OS's disk cache into your program space without an extra copy step, which saves time. And accessing data is super simple. You just use array indexing or pointers like mmap file 1 billion.
That sounds almost too easy, like magic. There has to be a catch, right? You mentioned taking control earlier. This sounds like giving control back to the OS in a way.
There's a big catch. The simplicity comes at the cost of, well, fragility. Error handling is the nightmare with map. Normally, if you access a part of the mapped file that isn't currently in RAM, the OS handles it smoothly with something called a page fault. It just fetches the data from disk behind the scenes. That's fine.
But if there's a real I/O error during that page fault, like the disk fails, or maybe a network drive gets disconnected, the OS doesn't return a nice Python exception.
Uh-oh. What does it do?
It sends your program a signal, usually SIGSEGV segmentation fault or SIGBUS bus error, which by default just instantly terminates your process. Crash.
Ouch. And trying to catch and recover from those signals is hard.
Extremely hard. It's very low level, not like catching a standard file I/O error. So mmap is fast, great for random access, but you trade robustness. It can be brittle.
Okay, so we have screaming for reliable sequential stuff.
Yeah.
And mmap for fast but risky random access. Those handle getting the data. But what about bigger tasks? Like sorting a file that's way bigger than RAM or grouping related records together from a massive data set? We need algorithms designed for this.
Right. Now we move up a level to the core out-of-core algorithms. The classic, the absolute cornerstone is external merge sort. This is the go-to algorithm if you need to impose a complete sorted order on a huge dataset. And it's explicitly designed around minimizing I/O, broken into two distinct phases. Phase 1 is run creation. You read in a chunk of data that does fit in memory, let's say M bytes. You sort that chunk internally using a fast in-memory sort like quicksort. Then you write that sorted chunk, which we call a run, back out to a temporary file on disk. Repeat until you've processed all the input.
Okay, so you end up with a bunch of temporary files, each one internally sorted. Makes sense. But I remember reading about some optimization here, something that sounds almost like cheating.
Yeah.
How can you make those initial runs bigger than your available memory?
You're thinking of replacement selection. It's a clever technique. Instead of just filling memory, sorting it, and writing it out, you use a data structure called a min heap.
Okay, heap.
You fill the heap, which takes up most of your available memory. Then you repeatedly take the smallest item off the heap and write it to the current output run. But here's the trick. As soon as you write an item out, you read the next item from the input file. If this new item is larger than the item you just wrote out, you can add it to the heap and it becomes part of the current sorted run. If it's smaller, you have to set it aside for the next run.
So if the input data already has some partial ordering, you can kind of extend the current run beyond the initial memory load.
Exactly. It leverages existing order. On average, replacement selection produces runs that are about twice the size of your available memory. This means fewer runs overall, which drastically cuts down the work in the next phase.
Clever. Okay, so phase 1 creates these sorted runs, maybe twice the size of RAM on average. What's phase 2?
Phase 2 is the merge pass. Now we need to merge all those sorted runs into one final sorted file. The naive way would be to merge 2 runs at a time repeatedly, but that's slow, requires many passes over the data. The optimization is K-way merging. We use our available memory to hold input buffers for toggle different runs simultaneously. Let's say each buffer holds one disk block, dollars data. You can merge roughly tol k equals MB dollar runs in a single pass.
So instead of merging 2 runs, you might merge like hundreds or thousands at once.
Precisely. You look at the next available element in each of the dollar input buffers, find the smallest one overall, write that to the output, and refresh the buffer it came from. This high fan-in dramatically reduces the total number of times you need to read and write the data to disk. Often just 1 or 2 merge passes are enough.
Got it. External merge, sort for total ordering, robust. But sometimes sorting is overkill, right? Like for SQL's group UI or finding distinct values or joining tables. You don't necessarily need the final result sorted.
Correct. For those kinds of tasks, grouping, aggregation, joins, we often turn to external hashing. It's usually faster if the data behaves nicely. It's also a 2-phase approach, kind of partition and conquer. Phase 1 is partition. You make a single pass over your input data. You take the key you care about, like the user ID you're grouping by or the join column, apply a hash function to it, and based on the hash value, you write the entire record to one of their different temporary files on disk called buckets or partitions.
The crucial part being that all records with the same key must hash to the same bucket, right?
Absolutely essential. If two records have the same user ID, they must end up in the same temporary file. Then phase 2 is conger, or sometimes rehash. You process each bucket file one by one. Because you designed Talis cleverly, each bucket should now be small enough to fit entirely into memory.
So you read bucket number 1 into RAM, build a normal in-memory hash table, and do your grouping or aggregation or whatever right there.
Exactly. You've broken the massive problem down into teller-independent problems that can be solved in memory.
And the classic database example of this is the Grace hash join, isn't it?
Perfect example. To join two huge tables, R and S on some attribute, you first hash both R and S using the same hash function on the join key, creating takeover partition files for R, R2, $2, R any dollar, and takeover's S. Das ist Takeacer. Then you only need to join the corresponding partitions.
Yeah.
R1 with $3, $2 with $3, $2, and so on. Each of those smaller joins can ideally be done in memory using a hash table.
That sounds really efficient in terms of I/O passes, compared to sorting both tables first, say.
It typically is. The ideal I/O cost is roughly reading R and S once to partition, then writing the partitions, then reading them back for the join phase. So about $3 times text size of S TONFL blocks transferred, often faster than external sort.
But, he said, if the data behaves nicely, hashing always has that one big potential problem, especially with real-world data.
The Achilles heel. Data skew. What if one particular key value is incredibly common, maybe an NLL value or a default ID or just one super popular category?
Right, then tons of records will hash to the same bucket.
And that one bucket might still be too large to fit in memory. When that happens, your performance tanks. You have to apply the hashing process recursively just to that one oversized bucket, breaking it down further. It adds extra I/O passes and kills the speed advantage.
Okay, we've got the main algorithms.
Yep.
External merge sort and external hashing, plus the access methods, streaming and map. When you're faced with a big data task, how do you choose? Let's start with aggregation or grouping. Sorting versus hashing.
It really comes down to speed versus predictability and whether you need the output sorted. Hashing, like the Grace hash join, is usually faster, fewer I/O passes if you don't suffer from bad data skew.
But if you hit skew, performance can fall off a cliff unexpectedly.
Exactly. External merge sort, on the other hand, is more predictable. Its performance depends mainly on the total data size and your memory block size, not on the distribution of key values. It's more robust. Plus, if you need the final result ordered anyway, like for an order by Y clause, sorting is the natural choice.
So, rule of thumb, hash for speed if you think your data is reasonably uniform, sort for robustness, or if you need ordered output.
That's a pretty good starting point, yeah.
Okay, let's switch gears to lookups. Finding specific records. We know that using a standard structure like a binary search tree directly on disk is terrible because of all the random IOs.
Complete disaster. A deep tree means many disk seeks. Hop, hop, hop down the levels. Very slow.
So databases don't use those. They use B trees. How do B trees fix the IO problem?
B trees are specifically designed for disk. The key idea goes back to locality. Each node in a B tree is designed to be exactly the size of one disk block, say 4 KB or 8 KB. Instead of having just two children like a binary tree node, a B tree node can hold potentially thousands of keys and pointers to child nodes. This gives it a very high fan-out.
So instead of being tall and skinny, the tree becomes short and fat.
Exactly. Because each node branches so widely, the total height of the tree, even for billions of records, is incredibly small, maybe just 3 or 4 levels deep.
So finding any record takes only 3 or 4 disk reads.
Precisely. A search requires $log bn IOs, where B is that large fan-out factor, items per block, that's asymptotically optimal for searching external data. It minimizes those costly disk seeks.
Amazing how the data structure itself is built around the properties of the disk. Okay, one more tool. Sometimes you don't need the exact data, just a quick check if something might exist, maybe to avoid a pointless disk lookup.
Yeah, for that, you use probabilistic structures, most famously the Bloom filter.
Probabilistic, meaning it's not always right.
Right. It's a very compact data structure, usually fits entirely in RAM, even for huge data sets. You use it to check for membership. The crucial guarantees are it has no false negatives. If the Bloom filter says this item is definitely not in the data set, you can trust it 100%.
Okay, so it can definitively say no.
Yes. But it can have false positives. It might say this item might be in the data set when it actually isn't.
So how is that useful?
You use it as a cheap pre-check. Before doing an expensive disk lookup, like a B-tree search, to fetch a record, you ask the in-memory bloom filter first. If it says definitely not present, you save yourself the entire disk I/O. You just skip it.
Ah, so you trade a small chance of doing an unnecessary disk lookup, the false positive case, for the certainty of avoiding most of the necessary lookups for things that aren't there.
Exactly. It's an I/O optimization based on probabilities. Great for filtering out requests for non-existent keys very quickly.
Okay, this is a great toolkit. But realistically, for complex stuff, especially distributed across multiple machines, are we building these external sorts and B-trees from scratch?
Usually not these days, thankfully. For really large, complex, parallel jobs, you lean on declarative frameworks. Think Apache Spark, Dask, or even older systems like MapReduce. These frameworks abstract away a lot of this complexity. When you write Spark code, you're often implicitly telling Spark to perform operations that, under the hood, involve massive distributed external sorting or hashing, the famous shuffle and sort phase in MapReduce. That is basically a giant parallel external merge sort happening for you. Hashtag tag 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 tag.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the big takeaway, it seems, is that when you hit that memory wall, you have to fundamentally shift your thinking. It stops being about CPU cycles and becomes almost entirely about optimizing I/O, minimizing disk reads and writes, making access sequential.
Absolutely. It's an IO-bound world once you're out of core. And one last practical point. Don't forget about those temporary files. External sort creates runs. External hash creates buckets. These all land on disk somewhere.
Right, temporary storage.
You need a robust cleanup. What happens if your program crashes halfway through? Those temp files can fill up your disk if you're not careful. Or if they contain sensitive data, leaving them lying around is a security risk. Good error handling with try.finally blocks, or maybe separate cleanup jobs, is critical for production systems.
Good point. System hygiene matters. And understanding this theory isn't just, academic. It helps you actually tune those big frameworks like Spark. When Spark is slow, knowing about external sorting or data skew helps you figure out why and maybe how to fix it by repartitioning or changing your approach.
Definitely. It unlocks the next level of performance tuning.
So let's leave our listeners with a question. Thinking about the tools and frameworks you use every day, Pandas, Spark, maybe just your database's query planner. Or do you now suspect there's a hidden Grace hash join performing a join or a K-way merge sorting your results under the hood? Have you ever hit a weird performance cliff that might actually have been caused by data skew in some hidden hashing step?
Yeah, look for the I/O patterns. Where's the system likely reading and writing large chunks sequentially? That's your clue.
Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.